Well, thank you for the invitation. And I did see there was a wide variety of topic in this workshop. So I kept it quite simple, hopefully. I'm not exactly sure who's in the room today, but we're going to go to something quite different, I think. It's past climate, and I don't think there was any talk on past climate yet. And particularly looking into deglaciation and past warm periods. Sorry. Okay, so just a broad overview of the last 450,000 years. So we're also looking into much longer timescales than what was just presented. But those are records from Epicadome C ice core in Antarctica. And the top one shows temperature anomaly over Antarctica over the last 450,000 years. And on the bottom panel, we see changes in atmospheric CO2. So as you most likely know, over that period, the climate variability was dominated by glacial interglacial cycles with a rather slow glaciation, as we can see here, with slow cooling over Antarctica, but also other parts of the world, associated with a drop in atmospheric CO2 of about 100 ppm. This was followed by a rather rapid warming period, which we called a deglaciation, which lasted about 10,000 years, during which, again, atmospheric CO2 increased. And here I've put as reference this year or maybe last year concentration in atmospheric CO2 to see the much rapid and unprecedented increase in atmospheric CO2 over the industrial era. So in this talk, I will mostly focus on, let's say, two periods of time. The last two deglaciations, so the penultimate deglaciation, which occurred sometime in between 140 and 128,000 years ago, which were followed by the last interglacial. And I'll compare this to the last deglaciation, which occurred between 20,000 and 10,000 years ago, and was followed by the most recent interglacial, which was the Holocene. So why are we studying the last interglacial? Well, the last interglacial, in fact, has received a lot of attention because it is supposed to be the warmest interglacial, so the warmest warm period, if you wish, of the last 800,000 years, with a mean temperature about 1 degree Celsius above present, even though the concentration in atmospheric CO2 was slightly lower than present. It was at 200 and well, it was much lower than present. It was at 275 ppm. But the issue with the last interglacial is that sea level was 6 to 9 meters higher than today, indicating a loss of mass from both Antarctic and the Greenland ice sheet. So this was not due to atmospheric CO2, but it was due to the particular insolation condition that occurred during that period. And one of the questions we will be also looking at today is the transient nature of this warming period, meaning the impact of the penultimate deglaciation on the last interglacial. But if we look at this plot of insolation anomalies, we can see that at the peak of the last interglacial, insolation was higher in the Northern Hemisphere in between May and September, whereas it was lower, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, in between October and March. So this led to a much larger contrast in seasonal insolation were different, which also impacted temperature. So numerical simulation of the last interglacial have been performed with a series of models, and the most recent exercise was done by the PMIP4, so Paleo Modeling Intercomparison Phase 3, which simulated the period 127,000 years ago. So this simulation were performed with full coupled model and forced with the orbital parameters corresponding to 127,000 years ago and a slightly lower atmospheric CO2 compared to pre-industrial, meaning 275 ppm. And here we see the ensemble in surface air temperature anomaly degrees Celsius in between December and February and June, August. And this is compared to pre-industrial. So what we can see on the left for the boreal winter is that it was globally colder everywhere, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, with a colder convection in the order of about 2 degrees Celsius. But you also note that the Arctic was still warmer. However, if we go to boreal summer, we see a large warming, and again, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, with up to 5 degrees Celsius warmer condition over land in the Northern Hemisphere. So this changes in temperature and in seasonal contrast led to changes in the atmospheric, large-scale atmospheric circulation and also the hydrological cycle. So this is an estimate of annual precipitation anomaly in between the last interglacial and the pre-industrial. And overlaid are some of the paleoproxy records that are available for that time period. So I'm not going to go in all the details of those paleo records, but they include pollen and speleothems and sediment composition, or even landscape features. So in green shade, we have an increase in annual mean precipitation, and in brown, we have a decrease. And what we can see is an increase in the monsoon system, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. So the North African monsoon and the Southeast Asian monsoon were stronger, whereas the monsoon in the Southern Hemisphere were weaker. So a weakening of the Australian monsoon, the South African monsoon, and the South American monsoon. So those changes in the hydrological cycle were mostly due to the changes in air-sea contrast. So for example, the strong cooling that was in the Southern Hemisphere in austral summer, of course, led to this reduction in the monsoon system. But we also noted some increase in precipitation over the adjacent ocean, etc. So here I wanted to have a bit of a closer look at the North African monsoon system, which gathered a lot of interest. So just a very simple slide on the West African monsoon as it is today. Basically, this is the circulation in boreal summer over North Africa. So we cannot really see here, but here at the edge, north edge of the map, you would have the Mediterranean, and here we have the Atlantic Ocean. And so you have during boreal summer, you have a low-level southwesterly flow bringing moist air from the Atlantic into tropical or equatorial Africa here and towards this Saharan heat low. Okay, so this leads to fairly intense precipitation around 10 degree or up to 10 degree north. And which also lead to this gradient in vegetation that we have today with fairly humid condition in the equatorial region and forest, and a gradient of vegetation until we have basically the desert of the Sahara at around 25 degree north and intense subsidence. However, this was not always the case. And if we go back in time, we can see that there were periods during which the Sahara was most likely vegetated, and it was fairly humid throughout all of North Africa. So this period have been called the Green Sahara or African Humid Periods, and they occurred during time of low precession, such as the Last Interglacial, but also the early or mid-Holocene. So this has been known for quite some time, and there's a range of paleoproxy records trying to reconstruct. So this was what was done here, trying to reconstruct the condition over North Africa. And Axel has done quite a lot of work on this, trying to show how those time of these African humid periods and those corridor of vegetation could have led to human migration from Africa into the Arabian Peninsula or even Europe. So here what we'll do is that we'll just follow up on this and basically look into a transient framework and try to see how, if the deglaciation that precedes those warm interglacial can have an impact on the condition that occur during the interglacial, and also trying to understand in a bit more detail how we can have an initiation, what controls the initiation of those African humid periods, maybe their amplitude and also their demise, because a lot of debate has been put out as to how fast they will end up and at what period of time those African humid period would cease. So for that, some transient simulation of the penultimate deglaciation and the last interglacial were performed with LOVECLIM. And this was compared to existing transient simulation of the last deglaciation and Holocene. So LOVECLIM is an Earth system model of intermediate complexity. So it includes a full OGCM, but the atmospheric model is a bit simple, and it's quite geostrophic. So it also includes a simple vegetation model and a carbon cycle model. So to perform this simulation, the model was forced by time-varying changes in orbital parameters, ice sheet topography and albedo, greenhouse gases, so atmospheric carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And deglacial meltwater input was added into the North Atlantic to simulate the millennial-scale variability of the last deglaciation. So I haven't talked much about that, but I'll briefly introduce it. So this is the main results of the simulation, which shows some of the main forcing and result for the period 140 to 120,000 years ago. So if we start from the top here, we see the changes in insolation at 65 degrees north in June, peaking here at about 127,000 years ago. In blue here, we see the increase in atmospheric CO2, as well as the increase in methane. So those are forcings in the model. We also add, as I mentioned, some meltwater, which is in gray, which triggers some changes in the Atlantic Meridional overturning circulation, and particularly a strong weakening of the overturning during a time which is Heinrich 11, which corresponds to a strong deglacial event of the Northern Hemispheric ice sheet, and which is believed to have slowed down the overturning circulation with implication for climate that we'll see later. So here we also see the changes in air temperature over Antarctica, just as a check of how the model is performing compared to Antarctic temperature estimate that are available from ISCO records. Here we see changes in sea surface temperature of the Iberian margin, which can capture some of the millennial scale variability associated with the deglaciation. So the cold condition simulated during Heinrich 11, with a fairly rapid warming at the end of Heinrich 11 associated with the recovery of the Atlantic Meridional overturning circulation. And now we can see the impact of those changing climate on precipitation. So here on the Iberian Peninsula and on the two bottom one over North Africa. So here I separated the Western Sahara from the Eastern Sahara, where we can see very dry, so almost no precipitation over this part of the world until about 128,000 years ago, when there is a strong and rapid increase in precipitation associated with the recovery of the Atlantic Meridional overturning circulation. The horizontal line that are here shows a pre-industrial precipitation level in the model. And so you can see that we have much wetter condition for the whole part of the interglacial, so until about 122,000 years ago. So first, just to have a look at some of the processes, I wanted to compare with the existing simulation of the last deglaciation and the Holocene, which is showed here on the right. And so again, here we have the insolation at the top. Here we have the changes in Northern Hemispheric ice sheet extent in both simulation, and you can see some fairly, some strong differences in the two that I will explain later. The changes in AMOC, and then on those two plots, we have the precipitation and vegetation cover over the East Sahara and the West Sahara. And so here what we can see is that over the western part particularly, we have much wetter condition during the last interglacial than the Holocene. And so I just wanted to show you some plots, so that you can see the extent of the changes in precipitation and vegetation cover in, so on the top we have boreal summer precipitation for the pre-industrial with the monsoon flow reaching about 12 degrees north. Here we have the same figure for the Holocene and here for the last interglacial. So what you can see is that this expanded precipitation reaching much more northward during the last interglacial, but also an increase in the amount of precipitation during all of North Africa. And on the bottom panel, we can see the change in vegetation cover. And again, we see large swaths of desert over most of North Africa in the pre-industrial, vegetation corridor starting to appear in the Holocene, and mostly vegetated North Africa during the last interglacial, apart from an area in the east. So this is where we can see the strong differences in the west and east, with a much larger increase in precipitation over this area in the last interglacial, and not much difference here in the east. So now if we go back to this plot, we also want to look at the transient changes in precipitation in these two different periods. And what we can see is a much more abrupt increase in precipitation during the early part of the last interglacial compared to the Holocene. So the forcing is a bit different. You can see that for the last interglacial, there were some stepwise change in Northern Hemispheric ice sheet extent. So this was a simulation done quite a long time ago, whereas the Northern Hemispheric ice sheet was only updated every 1,000 years. On this one, which is a bit newer, the changes in Northern Hemispheric ice sheet was a bit smoother, but also in agreement with the changes in insolation and the large event during here that occurred as Heinrich 11. We can see that it is expected that the Northern Hemispheric ice sheet would deglaciate more quickly during the penultimate deglaciation than during the last deglaciation. So we can see here that this increase, this very rapid and abrupt increase at the end of the penultimate deglaciation occur due to the combined effect of the much higher insolation, which would lead to a much more rapid decrease in the Northern Hemispheric ice sheet, and the rapid increase in AMOC at the end. So all those effects combined to have a very rapid increase in precipitation over North Africa to reach levels that are much higher than the Holocene. So here we have the contrary. We can see the effect of the Northern Hemispheric ice sheet lingering for about 3,000 years. So the interesting part is also how the peak in precipitation occurs here during the Holocene about 1,000 years after the peak in insolation, whereas during the last interglacial, the peak in precipitation can occur about 1,000 years before the peak in insolation. Interestingly, we note that both humid periods last for about the same amount of time during the last interglacial and the Holocene, even though it is much more pronounced during the last interglacial. So now if we put, I just wanted to quickly show, because I've talked about it a lot, and I was not exactly sure what the expertise was, but I've talked a lot about the impact of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. And so just wanted to go back and say that today we have deep water formation occurring mostly in the Labrador Sea and the Nordic Sea, and forming North Atlantic deep water, which sink here and flow southward in the Atlantic Ocean. So this is obviously a very simplified cartoon of the what we used to call the thermo-island circulation, or the global overturning circulation, which controls the transport of heat globally. So here, when we perturb the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, so weaken this system, we also weaken the Gulf Stream here. And so the transport of heat from the low latitude into the North Atlantic. So this has a strong impact on the tropical SST gradient. And I will show later, this is why it has such a strong impact of over precipitation in tropical North Africa. So if we now put all this information together, we simply put the results of all those simulations and plot the precipitation, which is here on the y-axis over tropical North Africa as a function of precession, because we know that precession has a strong impact on the meridional temperature gradient and therefore on precipitation over North Africa. And in the color, we put the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. So what we can see is that for positive precession, in this particular framework or particular model, we will always have dry condition over North Africa. And as precession decreases, there is an increase in precipitation. However, we can also see that if the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation is weak, then we will also have very dry condition. So basically, the precipitation is necessary, but not the only condition to have a wet condition. And we can also see that in a fairly wet background condition, we can have a very large variability in precipitation that is due to the overturning circulation, but also to some feedback from the vegetation. And here as well to the presence or not of Northern Hemispheric ice sheets. So to look into this into a bit more detail, a set of sensitivity experiments were done, where in turn each forcing parameter was set to keep constant at its glacial condition, so that we can see the impact of the orbital parameters, the Northern Hemispheric ice sheet, or the overturning circulation. So on the first one, we can see what would happen if there was no decrease in precession. So basically, if the orbital parameter were kept at their glacial level, and we would see that we would still have very dry condition over all of North Africa. Similarly, when the AMOC is really weak, you would have a similar pattern of very dry condition over North Africa. Of a lower extent, we still see the impact of the Northern Hemispheric ice sheet. And interestingly, we see within this framework no impact of atmospheric CO2. So if we keep the atmospheric CO2 at its glacial level, so about 180 ppm, this would have just a minor impact over precipitation over North Africa. So this is mostly due to the impact of each of these parameters of the tropical Atlantic SST gradient. So the gradient is measured as a difference in between the tropical North Atlantic and tropical South Atlantic difference in SST. And we can see that here precipitation over North Africa is a function of this tropical SST gradient. So if we have a warmer condition over tropical North Africa than tropical South Africa, then we can trigger an increase in precipitation. This is not as simple, of course, and will still depend on precession.
1 more minute, Laurie.
Yeah, I'm all done. So here's a conclusion. In this study, we show that there was a dominant control of the Atlantic meridian overturning circulation in the initiation of the African humid periods. And we also show that residual Northern Hemispheric ice sheet could delay the initiation of these African humid periods, with implication for other African humid periods that do not occur during interglacial. And we also showed that there was high variability under wet background condition, with abrupt event linked to vegetation albedo feedbacks and AMOC variability. And I haven't really shown this part. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Laurie. Let's start with some questions. Maybe I'll start first. You mentioned this tropical SST gradient across, or interhemispheric SST gradient in the Atlantic. So my question is it really the warming in the Benguela current that is the dominant driver for the changes in the AMOC effect on the African monsoon system, or is it the cooling of, let's say, the Mediterranean and the cooling that occurs off northern coast of Africa?
Yes, it's a good question. I think, I mean, in the framework I've seen, it was really the gradient, right? And actually, if you give me a sec, I don't know if I can just show you the maps of SST, but basically, not this one. I mean, if you have a cooling in the North Atlantic, that would, you can effectively reverse your tropical SST gradient. Therefore, that will have a strong impact on your dynamics, right? So whether you warm the south or cool the north, I suppose it should have the same impact, no?
Same direction, yes, yeah. But most of the arguments always start from the North Atlantic. I was just wondering if the Benguela warming actually plays a role, because there are some amazing paleo proxy records from that area that could be used for understanding the processes and the abruptness of the changes that you see in the African humid period.
Yeah, to be honest, I haven't looked into this thoroughly. I mostly looked at the gradient because I thought that was important. For example, in the CO2, it's a pity I don't manage to show you the map, but in the CO2 experiment, what happens is that you have the same effect on, okay, so here we go, and hide the slide. Do you see this one now?
Yes.
Okay. So the tropical SST gradient is not, so it's really tropical, right? I think it goes only to 30 north.
I see.
So it's 30 north, 5 north to 30 north, and then it's 5 north to 20 south. I should check it carefully. But so basically it's really centered on this area here. And so in the orbital case or the AMOC case, you clearly see this change in gradient close to the equator. Whereas in the CO2 effect, I think it's because you have a cooling in both regions that you don't see the impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So here you're talking about this warming. That's here right. On the top right? So obviously the warming is going to have a strong impact because you're taking the difference in between the two.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Other questions? Nothing online, I suppose. Okay, thank you very much, Laurie, for your presentation and greetings to Australia.